Mr. Larry Picus to present his funding model for small schools and prototype transition, which is item number 7 on the agenda. Just because you got to catch a plane in a few hours, so we want to give him some time.
Thank you very much, co-chairs, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here. It seems like it's been a long time since I've been in Wyoming, so it's a treat to be back. And I am very cognizant of the fact that when I woke up this morning, the Rockies were ahead of the Dodgers in the standings. So I'm very aware of it's a good time to be here.
That's only going to get worse for you.
Sadly, I fear you're right, Senator. I'm here today to talk about the small school adjustments in response to, I think, something you asked the staff to do in the last legislative session. And I think it might facilitate the presentation if I start real quickly by giving you my conclusion and then getting us there. And the conclusion is really that at this point, I wouldn't change the formulas or the things in the model, and that when this occurrence that it comes up that we'll talk about in a minute happens, I have a suggested off-model solution that I think is probably the most effective way to do it, and will enable us not to try to find a formula that will never really design to meet a variable kind of a problem. So with that, it's going to be this button. Show. There we go. It's going to point to the right place. So by way of brief background, there is the potential for substantial changes in revenue when the school's ADM changes from 50 to 49 or the other direction. The problem is particularly a problem if the enrollment goes from 50 to 49. An elementary school actually gets a little bit more revenue. It's a function of the minimum teacher parts of the model. Middle school would lose about $176,000, and a high school $346,000, which in a district that's got relatively low enrollment in total is a fairly substantial amount of money. And the question is, can we fix the model or the formula to do that? The reason this occurs is the current model calls for funding a school of 49 or fewer students with an assistant principal and 1 teacher per 7 students with a minimum of 1 teacher. Thank you. Okay. But above 49, a lot of different factors interact to make it not clear exactly what's going to happen often. So depending on the enrollment and the characteristics of the students, the minimum teacher numbers may kick in, or the core teachers plus the elective or specialist teachers may kick in, and then the demographics of students drive some of the certificated personnel counts that come up. So there's this dynamic interaction that occurs as it happens. And then you would now have a hold harmless for districts with fewer than 243 ADM. So some of this may just be mitigated by the fact that you're protecting districts that are small from dramatic drops in revenue to begin with. So if we go to the next slide, conceptually, theoretically, what sort of happens is, and I may jump back and forth between this slide and the next one to sort of show what's happening. But if you, actually, let's go to the next slide. If you look at basically you want to, the 2 lines that I'm actually producing here are identical except for one little gray hump at one point. And the gray hump represents the current law, and other than that hump, it's exactly the same as the dotted line. So as long as you have less than 7 students or less, you have 1 teacher. So that we have that very steep jump, so there's always a teacher there. And then there's a level line for a while, and then it goes up at 1 to 7. At 47 students, it actually turns out, or at 49 students, you go to the other model, and the curve flattens out a little bit, and then at some point when the minimum teachers disappear, it steepens up again a little bit. In the elementary school, it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Let's go back to the table. The table shows you where those kinks or inflection points happen at each type of school. So if the transition from the 1 to 1 to 7 to the next step of the model happens at 49, but funding at 1 plus 1 teacher for 7 provides more funding for schools at 47 students for elementary schools, at 73 students for middle school, and at 97 students for a high school. And it's a function of the fact that the middle schools and the high schools generate more minimum teachers. Matt's sitting here next to me, and when I miss, he's just going to jump in. He and I worked together on this, and I want to say that this is the analysis and the work that was done to get here was very much a shared task. So I want to thank him for his efforts and his help. He is the master of the model. Then the minimum number of teachers becomes provides less funding than the regular core model at different points. It's at 80 in an elementary school, 127 for middle school, and 162 at a high school, approximately. And that's because that number should be pretty solid, pretty close. But once you get into the standard funding of the model, the demographics of the students also drive some personnel assignments. Now, these schools are small enough that there's unlikely to be large changes in low income or ELL students or mobile students from one year to another. So those numbers are probably pretty close, but they could vary a little bit in the bottom row. So if we go to the graph for, we went all the way to middle schools, because really at the elementary school, very little change. But one solution we considered, which is represented by the, I'm trying to decide which way I want to do it. I'm a little colorblind, and the colors came up different on this than the other one. So we'll go top and bottom. But if you look at the, there is the higher line, and then there's the probably blue or whatever color dotted line, and then a solid line. There's that little gray line between the two. And what basically happens, the current law is essentially along the dashed line on the lower enrollments, and then it sort of jumps at 50, and then it follows the more solid line. So one of the things one could do is change the ratio of 1 to 1 to 7 and provide a steeper line up to about 49, where it would then flatten out, and the same things would happen afterwards. Another option is to, we're looking now at the middle schools, another option is to carry forward the 1 to 49 until it reaches the place where it crosses the current model line, which is at 73 for a middle school, and then follow the continuing rule. If we go to the high schools, same idea, just different points where these things happen. And it all kind of makes sense, and it's really fairly straightforward to solve this problem. The challenge is, and it goes way back to when I first came here to Wyoming, and the first question someone asked me is, well, Larry, what's a school? I said, it's a building where we educate children. And because there are very few schools that are actually just a straight elementary or a straight middle or a straight high school in Wyoming for many reasons, be it the economics of operating schools or the educational decisions that the leaders in school districts have made. You have many schools that have grade bands that are different than the elementary, middle, and high school bands that are in the model, and the model adjusts for all of those. So if we go to we created a hypothetical K-12 school that has like 150 students, or with 50 in each grade band. And then we tried to find solutions along the lines of the 1 to 1 to 7, or the 1 to 49, or whatever kind of rules we want. And as you can see, every solution we created has some sort of a jump somewhere in the model, which was the whole point of what we were trying to avoid. Now all we've done is taken the fact that I think this year we thought there was one high school that was going to run into this problem, and it turned out it didn't at the last minute. But now we have 6 or 7 places where this problem could occur, and the more opportunities you have for a problem to occur, one would assume the more likely it is for it to occur somewhere. So it just seemed crazy, because I could probably mathematically, if I spent 7 or 8 days and consulted with my colleagues over in the front here whose modeling skills are probably superior to mine, I could probably solve that problem. But then all I have to do is change the ADM in each of those grade bands, and I have a new problem to solve that I may or may not have solved with the first one. So my real concern is that if you do this, you'll never really build a model that will solve the problem. Let's go to the next slide. I think the other things you have to be concerned about is alternative school funding, which is one teacher, one assistant principal, plus one teacher for every 7 students, and that continues all the way forward. Depending on how other non-alternative school funding depends on grade bands, you just don't know what would be better for a school, whether it'd be better off being funded by as an alternative school or one of these other things. If we use what we called the slope approach, which was the dashed line in some of the earlier models, we have places where small schools up to 49 get even more money than they currently get. And if we use the dotted line approach, we have these problems occur at 72 and 96. So I finally said to Matt, and he was unable to talk me out of my recommendation. He's not made it clear that he agrees with my recommendation or not, and I'll leave it to him to tell you what he feels, is the fact that the dynamic interactions of the model really make it almost impossible to estimate what's going to happen or build a model. That the goal of this exercise is to ensure adequate funding for school districts and the continuity of programs. And arguably, a $350,000 drop in resources in 1 year could undo that goal or those assumptions. That is, that could be a substantial revenue challenge for a school district. So I've proposed what I call an off-model solution that gives a soft landing to a district when this happens. And really, what I think we would do is, I've used the example of a $345,000 revenue decline in 1 year. Essentially, the Department of Education would calculate the model funding for the school district. We would see in it that this $345,000 drop occurred, and the state would then make or provide through the revenue ways that the system works, whatever it is, 80% of that, which is $276,000. They just make a payment to the district of $276,000 to mitigate 80% of the effect of that. Then for each of the next 4 years, the district would essentially pay back $69,000 a year. And it would be done off model. It'd just be something that happens. It gets calculated by whoever's at the department or in the LSO to pay that back. If enrollment in that school went back up and that revenue drop went away, there was still the debt because you essentially loaned the district that money in the year it happened. So they still conceptually owe you the money. And if 3 years down it happens again, you just create a whole separate accounting for it to happen again. So what I'm really, as I started to say, I think to Senator Coe when I started, sort of the theory of if it's not completely broken, maybe there isn't a completely perfect fix, and maybe you should just try to make sure you solve the problem if and when it occurs. And I'm not sure the extent to which this has been a problem before. We were concerned this year that one district would have it happen. It didn't. It might next year. It might not. And so my thought was just address and adjust for that problem when it occurs, and don't try to build a formula that's really complicated. Staff can solve it and adjust revenues, and the school district, the fact that they're going to owe $69,000 or 20% of $175,000 for a middle school, they can plan for that loss of revenue each year going forward, because they'll know that that's essentially, it's kind of like I guess it's like borrowing money. You just owe the state effectively that amount of money each year, and it solves the problem of a large revenue loss, and yet doesn't just make it go away, which seems inappropriate as well. And it allows the district to have a more steady stream of revenue to ensure its adequacy. Now, as enrollments continue to decline, if that happens in the school, the model will reduce the total revenue that the school district gets, and the $69,000 will add to that challenge. But as you know, there are a lot of districts that were describing those very challenges earlier this morning, and you have fewer students, you have less revenue, and those are solutions that are largely localized kinds of decisions, I think. And what I'm trying to address is just this one sort of drop in revenue. Do you have anything you want to add, Matt? Did I catch all our points? I think I did.
Mr. Chairman, I think Larry touched on it very well. If we had a perfect model where we had only elementary schools, only middle schools, and only high schools, we could have solved this. But with the different configurations of a 6-12 school or a K-12 school, we illustrated the complexity of different cutoff points within if you have different cutoff points for an elementary, middle, or high school, and then you have a K-12 school, it creates even more kinks within that line. And if you look at just the current model, the line is the smoothest of those three options or the two options that we explored at looking at trying to solve this issue. It's a lot more complex than I first thought. And So I'll leave it at that.
And I concur. I thought it was a simple problem to solve too. And when Matt and I started talking, and it was, we spent a lot of time on the phone noodling through things and realizing, whoa, every time I'd say, we could just do this. And he'd realize no, or he'd say we could do that. I'd say, I don't think so. And we'd eventually get this. So really, my suggestion is to just, when it happens, if and when it happens, just help the district through the problem by softening the blow over 5 years. It's, from their perspective, a substantial sum of money. I think from the state's perspective, it's a fairly small amount of money. And eventually you're even.
This has been a situation that has been out there since we first recalibrated in 2005. Yeah. And it's difficult, it's hard, it's complex, like Matt says, so.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could, I would say that it's a problem for good reasons. That is, the legislature has made an effort for the last 13 years to make sure that small schools really did have resources to ensure that they could educate their children. It comes out of efforts to ensure other challenges to revenues don't occur, and to hopefully adequately fund small schools, which I think it does.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How many schools are in danger of hitting these benchmarks to where we would have to use this solution?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, it's unknown. Last year when we were modeling estimated funding levels, we identified a school in Fremont County District Number 2 and the high school. Based on actual data, they're right at the cusp. They're at like 50.012 ADM. Next year they may go below 49 ADM, but time will tell. And it's so hard to predict the actual ADM going into each of the schools that I don't know that I could provide an accurate answer.
Mr. Chair, Representative Freeman, if I could add, if you recall one of the slides that Dr. Stoddard presented compared the NCES enrollment projections for Wyoming with the actuals from the department, and there was that just sudden drop in that blue line that didn't match what NCES was projecting and estimating. We don't know why, but it happened, and if that were to happen in a couple of areas for some reason in Wyoming, again, there could be a couple of schools where it occurs, and then it might never happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But we're not seeing, let's say, 10, 15 schools happening at the same time to where it does become a significant figure for the state.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, I don't believe so. And it's even more complex with the small school districts, the 243 or fewer, because they have a hold harmless provision that they can't decrease more than 2.5%. And so that prevents a dramatic decrease, but in the larger district, they would feel that full effect. I'll leave it at that.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions. The first is, I get all of the scenarios individually, but when you worked up the hypothetical K-12 school scenario, I've been trying to figure out what you did, and I don't understand. So if you could go back through that, I would appreciate it.
I'll let you take the first shot, man.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative or Senator Office, on the hypothetical scenario, slide 8, we had in the top line, the top green line, we assumed that the slope from 1 to 49 would change to the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. So it would meet the 1 to 49 at each of those. So the minimum teachers would then kick in at 73 and 97. Up to there, they would be provided the 1 to 7 ratio for teachers. Then for the dotted line, the blue dotted line, we changed the amount on the crossover so that the point in which the funding would equal the current amount. Where is that table? Sorry, the 1 to 7 would be the blue dotted line where the 1 to 7 funding would cross over where the minimum teachers are at. The point in which the minimum of 8 middle school, 10 high school teachers, and 6 elementary schools is the top green line. But in order to do that, you have to change the small school decision. And so a middle school would have a small school of 73, and the high school would have the small school would be 97, and the elementary school would be 47. Currently, a small school decision is 49 across all grade bands. But trying to match up that point at the individual high school and middle school, you create more kinks because the formula isn't a consistent small school decision at 49. And then we distributed on the K-12 scenario, ADM equally across each of the grades to project what the resources on each of those lines would be.
So,
Mr. Chairman, K-12, so you basically.
Microphone.
Right. So K-12, you put 4 kids in a classroom is kind of the concept there. Switch between 4 and 3 or something like that. Is that, but with decimal points, obviously. But that's kind of the idea, so that you could have a full K-12. And this is that circumstance where we're stepping up the population of a full K-12 school, evenly distributed. Why, when we get to the higher ADMs, I guess this is what I'm missing. If we're talking about 49 as being the current cutoff, and then we've got 72 and 96. I think what's throwing me off a little bit is how am I getting to 300 and still have steps? Because at that point, it seems like it's not the uniform distribution, but you're treating the schools separately. I'm not understanding whether you're treating them separately as elementary, middle, and high within a small school, or whether you're having one K-12 school.
So, Mr. Chairman, this is where the current model is very complex in that so all resources for non-teacher positions are resourced at the highest grade band level for the total school's ADM, except for teachers are resourced at the individual grade band for a K-12 school. So the minimum of 6 elementary teachers, a minimum of 8 middle school teachers, and a minimum of 10 high school teachers. So theoretically, a school of 150 students, 50 in elementary, middle, and high school, evenly distributed, could generate 24 teachers for 150 students. And so when we go out to 300 ADM, it's assuming 100 in the middle, or 100 in elementary, 100 in the middle, and 100 in the high school. But the crossover point for middle and high schools are 127 and 162. And so we have.
Let me try, because I think there's a simpler answer. There's no simple answer, but the challenge was this particular graph is based on a set of assumptions about enrollments by band in that school. And as soon as you change those assumptions, then all of those points start happening in different places. Because you for everything but teachers, all the additional resources are generated as if the whole school is a high school. So that's what causes, I think, that drop at 300, is suddenly we were given a middle school more money than it would have generated on its own as a middle school. And then when that ended at 300, we had that drop at about 300. And then the bigger challenge is we assume 50, 50, and 50, or 49, 49, and 49. But what happens if you get 72 and 67 and 83, and then something else happens in there? And we think we can program that to figure it all out, because the model does that right now, but it just creates wide ranges of these kinds of problems. And suddenly you're observing all sorts of things that potentially are unfair, although in smaller amounts. And so really what I understood you to directing us to solve was that kink at 49, that drop. And so the way I would solve it is not try to overwork a formula that's already, I don't want to put a subjective word on it. Let me just say extremely complicated, okay? Which is still a subjective word. And really find a solution to the fact that what we're trying to do is make sure that that school district doesn't suffer unduly when its ADM drops. And at the end of the day, to me, it might just be a limitation of my abilities. The easiest thing to do was to just fix it off the model.
All right, Mr. Chairman, follow. I think what we had is the fix from last session, and correct me on the details, but basically a maximum rate of change of 2%. What was the 2%? Was it 2% of the district's funding, or was it 2% relative to that school, or how did that work?
Mr. Chairman, Ted looked up the exact language. I think it's 2.5%. I think it's of its prior year guarantee.
For the entire district or for the school that we're talking about?
Mr. Chairman, Center Office, for the entire district. And so in Fremont 2's case, since it was a high school, we projected about a $356,000 loss, but that would have exceeded the 2.5%. So they would have been held harmless to a lower amount of loss because of that.
Mr. Chairman, do you recall what that would have been for that district? I know that we've got it somewhere, but.
Mr. Chairman, Center Office, off the top of my head, I don't have that.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, what's the advantage to this proposed loan lend payback system as opposed to the maximum change system that we arbitrarily implemented, which honestly sounds similar in concept and seems to have been agreed upon? Do you see any specific advantage to that?
Mr. Chairman, the only advantage I see is that it opens the opportunity to districts that aren't small districts or 243. It's for districts greater than 243 ADM. This change in the model is not just limited to small school districts. It's limited to all schools. And so the advantage is you allow the phase in of the reduction to all districts, not just the small school districts.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I suspect that if a small high school in a large district created this loss of revenue, it would be less of a challenge for the large district to compensate for it because it has many other revenues. But again, the point is that a loss of one student shouldn't cost $350,000, which is what we're really trying to avoid here.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the mechanism, though, the overall mechanism that was looked at, which is a maximum rate of change, seems really very easy to implement, where if you lose one student and that one student represents 2% of the population of the school's revenue can't change by more than 2% of the in any given year, something along those lines. Seems a more direct approach with a continued landing. The off-model concept does scare me a little bit because we definitely work with the model and we have an expectation that it's not a loan and payback system, but rather how much is our funding for this year. The idea of creating liabilities, I mean, it's theoretically something we could do, but I'm looking for a system that would be potentially equitable. I guess the other side of that, though, is if you increase from 49 to 50, I assume all of the schools would want to immediately step up to the higher value and then have the slow decay back, which would be a challenge where if our two slopes intersect, we don't have that problem. But
I guess what I would say, Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss, I agree with you. I don't necessarily see the MyOff model suggestion has any advantages over the 2% decline, and it's really an issue of the level of tolerance for what you feel is the appropriate change in revenue to a school district from one year to the next. And I think with the hold harmless, which I think it took me a while to realize was in place, because I think it's something you did in the last legislative session, and there's a little gap in my experience here in Wyoming, so I have to keep my head working through those things, and so I apologize for that. But I think that the issue really is finding some kind of reasonable way to help a district mitigate a large change in revenue when it represents a fairly substantial piece of the revenues. And you're right, the maximum drop in revenue from 1 year of 2.5%, at least for, which is now for small districts, probably it would certainly work more efficiently. And then the issue is well, I can predict how school districts would respond. They prefer the model that gives them more money, because that's how I'd respond if I were a school business officer. But I think making one decision and having it so they know what the model is and what it does is really the long-term way to go in terms of responsible management of the state's resources and enabling districts to predict their revenues. But I don't see that my proposed solution is any more advantageous than the one you already have in place. I don't know if we'd modeled out what would have happened, what that district's revenue would look like under the two alternatives. We probably could have thought to do that, but I doubt it would be a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you, gentlemen. We'll take public test. Thank you. So we're at public comment for this portion of the agenda, which is funding model for small schools and prototype transitions. Charles, nothing?
I'm good.
Okay.
We already talked about 2.5.
Okay, no public comment, then we're going to go back onto the agenda, and that takes us up to number 4, which was 11:30, you'll note. We're updating the Hedonic wage index with Dr. Lori Taylor. Doctor, nice to have you back.
It's very lovely to be back. Is there a remote for the,
What?
you got me?
Matt's got it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very, very pleased to be back here, especially since it's a sweaty 90 back home. So this is absolutely a lovely place to be this time of year. I've been asked by LSO to provide you with information about a strategy for updating Wyoming's Hedonic wage index. And so I prepared a presentation which accompanies the report that I filed earlier in September. The issue is one that's very simple, which is that it costs different amounts to operate schools in different locations because labor costs vary from one part of the state to the next. Cost of living is different. There are available amenities in some locations that are not available in other locations. And there are strong reasons to believe that therefore the cost of hiring is going to vary from one district to the next. A regional cost adjustment like the RCA that's currently part of the formula equalizes the purchasing power of school districts so they can recruit and retain equivalent personnel. The analytic challenge with construction of an RCA is to develop an index that accurately reflects differences in costs from one district to the next, but that only reflects district characteristics that are outside of school district control. You don't want something that can be influenced or manipulated by the policy decisions of schools. You create perverse incentives in that way. So you want to identify those drivers of cost that are outside of school district control. Wyoming has a regional cost adjustment built into the FOMU, and the Wyoming's RCA is the larger of either the Wyoming Cost of Living Index, which is the WCLI, the Wyoming Hedonic Wage Index, the HWI, or a value of 100. So that the WCLI and the Hedonic Wage Index are based so 100 is the mean. So this construction essentially says that there are no districts where costs are below average in the state of Wyoming. That we're going to bring everything below average up to the average, and then we're going to the higher of the two of either the Wyoming Cost of Living Index or the Hedonic Wage Index. The challenge that one runs into with this, and I should note that the RCA applies only to the salary components of the funding model and not to other components of the funding model. The challenge that one runs into with this is that the Wyoming Cost of Living Index is updated semi-annually, that these data are refreshed by the powers that be every 6 months. And the Wyoming Hedonic Wage Index has not been updated since 2005. And so there is a growing differential between the two. Here's an illustration of the 2018-19 Regional Cost Index for the state of Wyoming. You will notice that the RCA there are 23 districts with a regional cost adjustment of exactly 100. There are 24 districts with a regional cost adjustment between 100 and 108, okay, suggesting that there are 24 districts within 108% of the state average. And then there's Teton County with an RCA of 145. So there, that is why Teton County tends to stand out in this particular map illustrating the current RCA. 10 of the current RCAs are based on the Wyoming Cost of Living Index. 22 districts have RCAs based on the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index. And 16 districts have RCAs that have been rounded up to the state average of 100. Okay. So the Hedonic Wage Index, which is an important component of the regional cost adjustment, hasn't been updated in any way since 2005. So it's based on a regression analysis of base salaries and other data from the 2003-4 and 4-5 school year. Things have changed in Wyoming since 3-4 and 4-5. It's based on essentially doing the thought experiment. What would you predict a district needed to pay to be able to hire the average Wyoming teacher, given the local labor market conditions, given the local geography, given the demographic characteristics of the students, circa 2003, 4, 4, 5. Okay, so the existing 2005 Hedonic Wage Index is a weighted average of a set of cost factors as they were at that time. And this is a map of the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index currently being used as part of the RCA. Okay. So there are concerns about using the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index in the regional cost adjustment here in 2018. The data are 13 years old and arguably no longer reflect as well the differences in labor cost from one part of Wyoming to another. When the model was originally constructed, the Hedonic wage model that was used to develop the HWI in 2005, the analysis included factors that would be considered problematic today, in the sense that they included as uncontrollable cost factors at least one variable that is arguably and quite clearly within the control of a school district, which is whether or not and to what extent that district paid supplemental salary to teachers in that district. The amount of funding one gives the football coach, or that the one allows for the band director or the debate coach, is a discretionary factor for school districts, not a factor outside of their control. And so at least heavily outside, it is heavily within the control of school districts. And as such, it is problematic to include that as an uncontrollable cost factor in a regional cost adjustment. Because salary supplements were treated as uncontrollable, okay, the model for the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index is structured off of base salary. Quite frankly, when people are making a decision about whether or not they want to take the job in Laramie, they look at their total compensation, their total pay, not just their base pay. And so it's picking up partially what was driving teacher location decisions in 03, 04, and 04, 05. And finally, the statistical model that my colleague and friend Bruce Baker used to estimate the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index was limited in the data available to it, and therefore does not use statistical techniques to adequately control for differences in teacher quality. The problem with that is that's one of the big criticisms of Hedonic wage index is if you don't accurately control for differences in teacher quality in the estimation of these, you will misinterpret a high spending district as a high cost district because they've chosen to trade up to teachers with extra credentials and additional experience and a number of characteristics that make them earn a higher compensation. If you don't control for those characteristics of the teachers, then you risk misinterpreting high spending as high cost. And so one of the essential elements of a hedonic wage index construction is to do what you can to control for differences in the personnel that the districts have chosen to hire.
Senator Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've heard this, 6 times now or something like that, but I have a new question.
Oh, okay.
So, a new one, a different one that I don't think I've asked before unless I just forgot. Is there ever any discussion about the fact that if you have a sort of a pristine pool of data where you've just walked into it and you're developing a hedonic wage index, all of what you said makes a lot of sense, where if you control for those factors, you can then see how the labor market differs from place to place. We've got a situation though where we've used the same HWI as a factor, and we've used differences for regional cost adjustment for the past 13 years that have been relatively static, to the point where we have implemented economies and ability to spend on the districts. Mm-hmm. And those are relatively stagnant, although there are obviously some variations depending on the area. So does there come a point at which, when you're looking at the teacher labor pool, the model itself starts to become a factor in the model?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, this is a very legitimate concern, which is that the way that which the ability to pay of a district might or might not influence the salary schedules that they offer. And that's basically what you're asking,
yep,
is to what extent is stability to pay playing in here. And economic theory will tell you that teachers won't accept a lower salary from a poor district just because the district is poor. Okay, if the district lacks the ability to pay, they will have fewer applicants. The people will move on down the road to the districts able to offer a better compensation package to them. And the teachers will sort according to desirable characteristics like their language ability or their mathematics skills, or whether or not this particular individual is a very good at classroom management. And so when you have differences in ability to pay on the part of districts, it tends to lead to a sorting of teacher quality. But because we don't expect teachers to accept low wages from a district just because the district is poor, we would expect instead that they will sort out. So the districts with great ability to pay will be able to hire the pick of the crop, their selection of teachers. And the districts with limited ability to pay will have a limited opportunity to hire the highest quality teachers. That's what makes it increasingly important to adequately control for differences in teacher quality in estimating the wage index. If you successfully model differences in teacher characteristics, then you have successfully captured the dimension in which ability to pay influences the pattern of teacher salaries.
Great. Well, that makes sense, but it assumes that the market fluidity allows for that, and the assumption then is that it is an optimized market, and probably a relatively quickly optimized market. Is there literature that supports that? Is that a finding that teachers really will say, you know, on an annual basis is almost what it sounds like it has to happen, where every teacher in the state looks around and figures out what their optimal place is, and then they all shuffle. Mm-hmm. But we know that doesn't actually happen. So is there concern when you're assuming that you have to have that take place to avoid the effects of the model influencing the model, like I mentioned before? We don't have that kind of turnover to allow for that, do we?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, the model doesn't require a fruit basket upset. It doesn't require that everyone move, just that at the margin there be sufficient turnover And an 11 or 12% turnover rate is, in my estimation, adequate to the task, because you're going to be bringing in each year a certain crop of new teachers. You're going to be having a certain amount of retirements, and that leads to the opportunity to select according to who you're going to bring on board each year, approximately 10% of your labor force. And that is a very powerful marginal effect on compensation. If you're not getting the applicants for that 10%, economic theory suggests the wages will adjust.
Do you ever just control and isolate the variable so that you're looking at everybody but teachers in the districts? In other words, I look at the entire labor market, exclusive of teachers, look at the teacher market, and see if there's consistency between those trends as a means of testing that.
What I have done, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, what I have done is very much in the spirit of that approach, which is to use data on average earnings by occupation for every Wyoming county, and looking for whether or not there is a local premium in a particular county that is present in all kinds of occupations, not just teaching. And that approach is essentially a Wyoming-specific version of work that I did for the National Center for Education Statistics in estimating the prevailing wage for college graduates in each labor market in the country. And that particular wage index is embedded in the hedonic wage model that I want to show you today.
The doctor started, he just said that was college. I'm Dr. Taylor, I'm sorry. That was college.
It's very flattering to be considered Dr. Sally.
College educated people. What about ones that are not college educated when you say that?
Okay. So the work that I did for the National Center for Education Statistics looks exclusively at college graduates.
Okay.
The work that I did for the state of Wyoming sweeps up all occupations, not just those occupations held typically by college graduates.
Thank you for the clarification.
Right. So the work that I am presenting to you today updates the hedonic wage index for Wyoming in, I think, four very important ways. The first and most obvious is that we're going to use more recent data in a much longer time series. So whereas the 2005 hedonic wage index is based on 2 years of data from 03-04 and 04-05, this model is based on the most recent 5 years of data through the 17-18 school year. That the additional data allows for more precise estimates of local labor market costs. I'm going to model total salary, not just base salary, which is more reflective of the labor costs facing districts. I'm going to use a much richer set of controllable cost factors to capture as best as we can statistically those differences in teacher characteristics from one district to the next that could explain why average salaries are higher here than they were there. And finally, I'm going to revise and expand the set of uncontrollable cost factors, which is going to improve the predictive power of the hedonic wage model. Which essentially means that it does a better job of explaining how teacher salaries currently fall out in the state. The graphic that you have here, and what is, I now realize, regrettably teeny tiny type, is a description of the teacher characteristics that are included in this model. So these are the individual teaching assignments, their non-teaching assignments, whether their years of experience, not just in total, but also the years of experience that they have with a specific school district, length of the school year, the set of characteristics that are being controlled for in trying to predict teacher salaries. So the differences in the mix of vocational education teachers versus mathematics teachers from one district to the next aren't driving differences in the hedonic wage predictions. I offer as contrast the set of controllable factors from the 2005 hedonic wage models. So what we're doing is essentially exploiting the data available to us in the state of Wyoming to describe much more rich way the choices districts have made about the people that they have on payroll. Okay. In addition, the uncontrollable cost factors, the factors that drive differences in labor costs from one district to the next that are outside of school district control, I'm going to use what I firmly believe is a stronger and richer model of that. The first uncontrollable cost factor is the cost of living index. The WCLI clearly captures a lot about differences in housing costs from one part of the state to the next, and that's an important driver of differences in labor costs for school districts and needs to be included. The county wage index captures the prevailing wage for people who are not educators in the county, and as such picks up these factors like Sweetwater is located in one of the communities where the county wage index is the highest in the state, okay, which is that they are in competition with and reflective of substantial outside of education labor pressure. Factors of geographic isolation, an indicator for whether or not the nearest hospital is more than 25 miles away, because isolation of that sort is relevant to the day-to-day decisions of teachers. And how far are you to the nearest city of 50,000 people? How far are you to the nearest city of 15,000 people? The model no longer uses miles to Yellowstone, which is one of the drivers in the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index and therefore still embedded in the RCA. And then student demographics. I'm going to pick up the percent free lunch, the percent special ed, and the percent of English language learners, because my prior work for y'all tells me that that does a better job of explaining what's going on with salaries. So I've estimated a 2018 Hedonic Wage Index, and the map illustrates that index here. Again, Teton County is the highest labor cost environment in Wyoming. That is something that you get from the WCLI. It's something you get from the Baker Hedonic Wage Index. It's something you get from my work as well. If you compare the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index and the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index, you're going to get that by construction, the average is 100, because that's what the average is supposed to be. That the 2018 estimates run from a minimum of 90 to a maximum of 116. Okay, if you were to exclude Teton County from a minimum of 90 to a maximum of 106. This is very similar to the range for the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index, but the pattern, of course, is not identical because there have been changes over time in housing costs that drive differences in the Hedonic Wage Index from one location to the next. So if one were to simply replace the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index with the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index in the regional cost adjustment, the RCA would increase for 9 Wyoming districts, decrease for 14 districts. Most of the districts would experience 1 percentage point swing either way. But there are a few where the changes would be relatively dramatic. Fremont County School District number 6 would see its RCA increase from 100 to 106. That's a reflection of geographic isolation there. All of the districts in Sheridan County School Districts number 1, 2, and 3 would have a common RCA of 105, whereas currently Sheridan County School District number 2 is at 107, and the other 2 Sheridan County districts are sitting at 100. So, and then moving in the other direction, Natrona County School District would see the RCA go from 106 down to 100. Reflect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss.
I know we have this in here, but typically, what time periods data are we incorporating in the 2018 HWI? What are my typical lag times? And I know that varies depending on the components you're using.
The data is 17, 18 characteristics, but we use the 17, 18 data for all of these in predicting the index values. We estimate the relationship between those index values and labor costs using data from the 5 years ending in 17, 18. Thank you. Okay. So I do feel obliged to bring to this committee a couple of equity concerns that I have about the RCA, and this is the same song, second verse. I think I've probably shared these perspectives with you before. One is that rounding districts up to the state average defeats much of the purpose of a regional cost adjustment. If one district has costs that are 5% more than the other, okay, equity requires the 5% more funding, even if they're both below the state average. So by pulling everybody up to the state average, this kind of like woebegone approach where no one is below average, does tend to mute the impact of the regional cost adjustment and therefore undo the intent, which is to put all the districts on a level playing field. The second is that the Wyoming Cost of Living Index, like any cost of living index, is going to overstate the cost of hiring in locations that have attractive amenities. Because there are people that live in San Francisco despite the horrible housing costs because of the amenities of the community. They want to be there. And so you don't have to pay a full premium to cover the housing costs to get people to want to live there. I firmly believe that Teton County is a similarly attractive kind of place. If you look at the relationship between the Wyoming Cost of Living Index and the RCA, what you will observe is that the wages in Teton County are, this is just the first step on the salary schedule in each district, that the wages in Teton County are the highest in the state. And they are just almost 22% above the state average for starting salaries. But they're not 45% above the state average, which is what the WCLI would imply. And what makes the most sense to me trying to understand this pattern is that there are amenities that make Teton County a very attractive place to work and to live. And that's what's picking this up. Because the other explanation is that there is some sort of quality sorting going on here. And that Teton County is paying below market wages and therefore attracting the kind of individuals that accept jobs with below market wages. One option available to this committee is, rather than continuing the three-pronged approach to regional cost adjustment, you could go with a single cost adjustment. One obvious available single cost adjustment would be to use the Hedonic wage index for all districts as the regional cost adjustment in the state. And I would argue that you should do so recognizing variations in costs below the state mean, not just variations in costs above the state mean. And there are a couple of ways you can implement that. One would be to set essentially a floor and then make adjustments up from there. So you reinterpret the RCA as a kind of a state minimum rather than pegging it to a state average. And then you go up from there. It would be, of course, extremely expensive and arguably inappropriate to start at the state minimum for the RCA and apply it to the state average salary level. That seems very problematic to me. But it's within the power of this committee to implement the Hedonic wage index as you see fit. Basically, I'm just arguing for keeping the pattern and not arguing for where you peg the pattern. So Conclusions of my prepared remarks is that the cost of education varies widely within the state, and that offers very strong support for a regional cost adjustment. Regional cost adjustments are appropriate and necessary component in the Wyoming funding formula. Updating the Hedonic wage index would represent a major improvement over the status quo. It's difficult to defend an index that's based on the Hedonic wage index from 13 years ago, the characteristics of districts from 13 years ago. But I firmly believe that the equity goals in Wyoming would be better served if the legislature replaced the three-way design of the RCA and used a single index for regional cost adjustment. Thank you very much.
Questions? Comment? Oh, no, got feet this time. Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You costed out your recommendation, but in the notebook, there were the two other recommendations, or the two other ways that we currently do that, and you didn't cost those out?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bovee, I was asked to explore two different ways of doing things, and in the appendix are the index values for these two different ways. One is swapping out the Hedonic wage index in the RCA from 2005, replacing it with the 2018. For the districts that are reported in the report, things would change. For the other districts, the districts that are currently being rounded up to 100 or that are currently based off of the Wyoming Cost of Living Index, that would not change if you were to simply swap out the two indices in the existing structure. The other option, which I provide in the appendix, would be to what would the RCA look like if it was based exclusively on the Hedonic wage index.
Mr. Chairman?
Follow-up.
So are there plans to release the detailed calculations for districts to see what factors were used to arrive at these conclusions? So, for example, Cheyenne stays flat at 106, but Natrona County goes down from 106 to 101, yet they're very similar sized districts. So why the discrepancy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bovee, the details of the exact weightings are available in two places in the report, in Table 4 and in Appendix Table 1. And so that's going to tell you what the various pieces are. And so that one essentially uses the weights expressed in that table times the local values for the percent free lunch students, the population density, the Wyoming Cost of Living Index, the county wage index, and one basically applies the formula and gets to the existing index. So those foundational pieces of information are available in the appendix. Appendix to the report.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you. You know, Teton County is just such a unique place. But thinking about other states in the Rockies, and I'm thinking about Colorado, I know that there's, you know, a lot of disparity in their state's geographic areas as well. I mean, places like Aspen that are, you know, often compared to Teton County versus places on that aren't as, you know, property wealthy in Colorado. And so I'm trying to do like a cursory study of how other states kind of do it. And is there any other way that we can look at those unique outlier communities where there's an extreme amount of wealth? And even looking at Colorado, it doesn't seem like we can even make an apples to apples comparison because of how they fund their education system. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else we can be looking at to kind of understand if, because we're not alone in this. And so I'm just trying to get a bigger picture. Because we're obviously talking very much about just Wyoming. So I'm just trying to back up a little bit so I can get a broader understanding. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, in my 2015 report to the, I think the formal is the Joint Committee for Recalibration-ish. So we'll go that. I laid out the 3 basic strategies that are used for regional cost adjustment and explored specifically Colorado's approach compared to Wyoming's. What Colorado does is they use a version of a cost of living index, but their weights in that cost of living index put much less weight on housing cost differences than the Wyoming cost of living index does. And as a result, nearly all of what's going on with the Wyoming cost of living index at this point is housing cost differences. So when you put a lower weight on housing cost differences, you get a narrower range to a cost of living index.
Further questions for Dr. Taylor? Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Dr. Taylor, you included in your appendices, but I don't think you talked about the idea. You've got some concepts of phasing in and some changes. There's some good bits in your appendices where I think you're providing some possible policy options. Can you just provide a little bit of background of what you provided us in the appendices so that we understand what we're looking at here?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, yes. LSO asked me to explore or to suggest a strategy for phasing in a transition from the 2005 Hedonic Wage Index to the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index. And so for each of the 2 scenarios I examined in my report, one which was just a swap out in the existing structure, the other was to replace the RCA with the Hedonic Wage Index. I developed a time path to get from 2005 to 2018, assuming that no district would experience more than a 2% change in any one year in the regional cost adjustment. And if one were to simply do a swap out and were to allow for a change of no more than 2% each year, it would take 3 years to phase in the swap. If you went to replace the Hedonic Wage Index based with a state mean at 100, okay, so just take the RCA, replace it with a Hedonic Wage Index, then much of the state could be transitioned to the new Hedonic Wage Index within 5 years with a small change each year. But the changes to Teton County would be more dramatic than that.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that was discussed a few years ago, I don't remember how many, was the idea that if we do adhere to the concept of having an ECA each year, and we'll say arbitrarily the ECA is 2% a year, which had been an average for a while, did you give any thought to incorporating the ECA concept where you're growing each year to balance or offset the change in RCA? Did you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, those 2 pieces of the funding formula serve different purposes. The ECA is to adjust for changes in price over time. So it reflects common experiences of all districts going up, and so one adopts an ECA to essentially maintain the status quo, to keep the purchasing power of districts at the current levels. As prices rise, one makes an ECA adjustment. The RCA is the geographic analog to an inflation index. It's to address differences in price over space rather than over time. And so one would make the RCA adjustment independently of an ECA adjustment. Now, legislatively, you don't have to do things piecemeal. But analytically, These are two different indices designed to address two different dimensions of price.
Further questions, Dr. Taylor? All right. Matt has a presentation on the same subject. So thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your notebooks, the green page after Dr. Taylor's report puts the analysis Dr. Taylor just spoke to into estimated fiscal impacts by those affected districts. Recall, the interim topic was only to really, the purpose was to just update the Hedonic wage index portion of the regional cost adjustment. It was not to replace the RCA wholly with the updated index. So, for example, Teton County School District would still maintain its WCLI, or any district that would have the WCLI be greater than the 2018 Hedonic wage index would still have that within the funding model. So within my two-page memo, I provide on page 2 in table 1 the estimated impact for the school districts that would have the RCA change. We looked at this in two different ways. One would be to just fully adopt the 2018 Hedonic wage index. If that were to occur, a net decrease to the funding model would be $6.3 million. And if we would take the recommendation of phasing in the increase or decrease for no more than 2% a year, it would be a net decrease for fiscal year 20 of $2.3 million. Also within the report, Dr. Taylor mentioned that you could look at this asymmetrically and apply the total increase to those districts that gain from the RCA, and then phase in for any districts that lose. And in my last paragraph, I estimate that net reduction to be $1.8 million in fiscal year 20. So, Mr. Chairman, that is the fiscal impact for estimated fiscal year 2020, and be more than happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Matt? Senator Wass.
Mike?
Mr. Willmarth, I don't see Teton County on this list. Did I miss something?
No, Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberg, you did not miss anything. So Teton County would not be affected by updating the Hedonic wage index. They would still utilize the WCLI within the RCA, the three-pronged approach,
Okay.
which would be the minimum of 100, or the greater of the two, WCLI or the 2018 Hedonic wage index with a minimum of 100, or the statewide average. So the school districts you see in Table 1 are the only districts that would have either a positive or a negative change to their RCA.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you're welcome.
Further questions for Matt? Thanks, Matt. So committee, we need a little direction. Do you want to draft a bill?
You can take public comment.
Oh, well, let's take public comment. Yes, thank you. We'll move to public comment. Excuse me.
Seeing none, we can go ahead.
All right. No. I wondered.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairs. Janine Bate-Teskey from Teton County. I guess let me begin by rephrasing what Representative Bovee said. It is of curious nature to me, and I am certainly not sophisticated enough to go through the algorithm to figure this out, but if you look at Natrona County, for example, what are the components within the 2018 HWI that create such a drop in Natrona County? I think that's one thing that people really need to understand as we move forward. Focusing on Teton County, I just want to make it perfectly clear, we do not pay a regional cost on any of our extra duty contracts. We view those contracts to be discretionary. Every year when we adopt our compensation package in May or June, whichever month we choose to do it, we set up those contracts, and those are the amounts that move forward. I will say that, there's been a lot of talk about how great it is to live in Teton County, and any of you that have been there this summer, I'm not sure I could say it was great with all the traffic and congestion and all that we've experienced, but I would say that the major decisions, the first decision point, and we hired 27 new teachers this year. Some were replacement, some were new adds because of our increased enrollment. The first decision that is taken is, can they find a place to live? Forget about how much it costs. Can they find a place to live? I will suggest that I believe the situation is going to get worse before it gets better. As we talked about briefly, I think Senator Coe, we got gigged real hard with the assessment process, the property assessment process this year. And part of it was allegedly, and I'm only repeating what I've read, which many of you could have read the same thing, is that in the past we weren't doing it accurately, and there were properties that were considered rental properties, so they were apartment complexes, trailer parks, so on and so forth, that had been registered as residential properties and now are commercial properties. So we are seeing properties, I heard one was 896% increase in their property taxes. Another was 1,100% increase in their property taxes. To think that that won't be passed on into rents would be naive. So I can only see our rents going up even more. There was a comment made that we are not paying it, the 45% is not realized in our average salary. I can't tell you if it's realized in our average salary or not. I will just tell you that our average salaries are on the low side of things simply because when you look at the components, the housing component of the WCLI, it's based on rents. So what happens is folks will come in, they'll enjoy the amenities, they'll sort of tolerate paying 50 to 60% of their salary in rent, and then after a while they leave. They can't afford to buy a house, they want to settle down and have a family. So our experience level, I believe, if you were to ask WDE, is on the low side of the spectrum. So on an average, yes, that's correct. If you look at starting salary, our starting salary at 58% or 58,000 is close to the 45% of regional cost. You'll see it in the starting salary. I also want just to remind everybody that as we sit here and we look at this, well, one of the things I think we all love about Wyoming is its diverse nature. And when you look at what the drivers are of the regional cost, it varies all over the map. Teton County, it's housing. You look at Sweetwater County, you look at Campbell County, it's wages. It's wages of the oil, gas, and mineral industry, right? And so I think we all know we can try and make one size fit all, but it's going to be really, really, really tough. And I guess in closing, I'll just say that Teton County is a recapture district. The numbers I've seen are, and I don't even know now that some of the other assessment has been completed, but we'll be sending somewhere between $6.5 and $6.5 and $7 million of taxpayer dollars, not gas and oil or mineral money, back to the state for redistribution. At the same time, as I've mentioned to some of you, we'll also be sending about $1.5 million back where we underran the budget that you also graciously approved for our new elementary school. And I thank you all for that. So I stand for any questions you may have.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Jeanine, you said earlier that I was argumentative today, so I don't mean to be, but the 58,000, I did the quick math, and 40,000 would have to be the statewide average starting salary. for teachers for it to be 45%
I believe it's
over that.
39, isn't it? The model,
No, we're talking, that's what I'm saying. The model is, I think, 39 for the starting salary. if
right,
I'm not
so we are
mistaken.
basing our 45% off the model, Senator Rothfuss.
But no, it would assume 45% over the model, we need to be relative to the other districts of the state.
I can't hit a moving target. I've got to use what the model starting salary is. I can't be using the average from all the rest of the districts across the state.
No, I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but again, my district is at 100%, right? It's to the 1.0. Our starting salary is not 40,000. I could find out what it is, but I'm going to guess 5K to 8K more than that. I'd look around 5K. Nobody knows. Okay. So what is that?
43,800.
43,800. So the 1.45 needs to be relative to the true market starting average across the state. All right, we'll argue about that later. I disagree.
Chairman Coe.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Janine, Superintendent Como talked about not being able to find people, period. Whether it's bus drivers or custodians or whatever, just cannot get the people. You have kind of a reverse scenario in Jackson because of the cost of living. And I guess I'd further say that every time I pick up the Jackson Hole News and Guide, the last 3 pages are totally full of help wanted ads in the Jackson paper. Do you have any comment on that?
I do. So one of the ways that we have found to be able to attract particularly part-time employees, which is food service custodians, bus drivers, is, like it or not, we pay health insurance or provide health insurance for all of our employees, even our part-time employees. And so, as you well would think, if we don't provide health insurance to food service workers, for example, they're going to go work in hotels. They're not going to come work for us. So that is indeed, there are a lot of folks that we have that work for us that work for benefits more than they do for hourly wages.
Further questions for Janine? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Co-Chairs, Jeremy Smith, Business
Mike.
Manager. Good afternoon, Co-Chairs, Jeremy Smith, Business Manager, Shared Number 1. I'll keep my comments brief as we're behind schedule already. And this is related to the Hedonic wage index and really all RCAs. What we're doing now doesn't frankly make any sense using a 2005 wage, Hedonic wage index. So simply put, something has to be done. It was a political compromise at that time to go with 3. It makes sense to continue that political compromise, but to have an index that doesn't change over time simply doesn't make any common sense. So our suggestion simply would be do something with this and not just bury it one more time. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd take any comments or any questions.
Questions for Jeremy? Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, Mary Jo Lewis, Coordinator Business Services for Park Number 1. I know this will come as a shock because we're one of the districts that's losing money, but we actually discussed this and we support the fact that this is being reviewed and looked at for the simple fact that we agree. 2005, we know that it probably should have been being kept up all along. The concern we have is the big hit that everybody does take when you do lose. On this model, we like that the new factors that were put in, Superintendent Curtis couldn't be here today, but we discussed this before I came. And the only thing we would ask is that you do consider doing this as a phase-in if you do move forward with this, rather than doing all of it in one shot. And I have the right to rescind my support if you take away cash reserve later on in this conversation. That's it. Thank you.
Questions for Mary Jo? Thanks, Mary Jo. Further public comment?
Co-chairs, members of the committee, my name is Ryan Kelly. I'm business manager for Natrona County School District.
Good afternoon, co-chairs and committee. My name is Michael Jennings. I'm the executive director of human resources for Natrona County School District. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak and talk to you regarding the regional cost adjustment materials. One of the many strides the legislature has made for school funding over the years is the model's transparency. And so when we were reviewing materials that were put forward for today's meeting, I was safe to say I was quite surprised when I saw the LSO's profiling of the regional cost adjustment using the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index, showing that Natrona County would drop 5 points, which is $4.7 million. So when we were looking at this, and we've been looking at the history of Natrona County, beginning in 2014, 2015, we had a board of trustees and a superintendent with foresight, and we see the economic landscape of the state of Wyoming. We set in place and we identified that of the $400 million shortfall public education was going to have at that time, about $10 million was our share. So we started to work on reducing our operational budgets over a fiscal 3 years by $10 million. That resulted in, we closed 5 schools. We closed 4 elementary schools, 1 middle school. We've eliminated approximately 220 positions district-wide. Of those 220, 75 have been at the central office and extended campuses when I look at transportation maintenance, special education services. We really try to, as a board and staff, to focus on the learning and the education of students and try to keep the cuts as far away from them as we can. It's not possible when you're closing schools. Our enrollment dipped. We were down approximately 350 elementary students. This year, our enrollment is back up, but we're still down about 31 elementary students overall. So our concern is the way that the update of the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index within the RCA disproportionately hits one school district. We're the one school district that looks to take the substantial hit of 4.7. So when you put it in perspective and you're looking at the cuts that have been made over time, Natrona County School District, whether it is phased in, and fortunately the last round of cuts were phased in, we'd be looking at a $15 million cut over a period of 4 or 5 years. To us, that seems like it's disproportionate. There are safeguards put in place within the model that allow school districts that are below 100 to be held harmless. And it appears to us that, being the district that is hit the hardest, that it is disproportional toward us. So that's where we're trying to figure out what is the right way to move forward without holding one school district dramatically different than the others.
Your suggestion is?
Well, when we've talked about this quite a bit, what is the suggestion? What we'd like to do is say, cost out and look at the other 2 alternative approaches that Dr. Taylor brought forward. And one of those does elevate all districts to 100 and then go from there, which would be an increase for all districts except for Teton. That was one example. And the other one is to truly look at it from an equity, I'm going to call it fairness, maybe equity is not the right standpoint, is say if we're truly going to do this, look at implementing the 2018 Hedonic Wage Index for all districts and not have the 100 floor.
Okay, questions, comments?
Anybody?
Okay.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, co-chairs, members of the committee, Alex here, Superintendent of Campbell County. Let me start by saying this. I'm the generalist, and the gentleman next to me will get into a little bit of detail, and we'll be as brief as we can. One thing that's missing from the information you have is a historical look of the impact of RCA on districts since 2005. For example, Campbell will show us going from 106, where we currently sit, to 105, a 1% decrease of 600 and some thousand. What it doesn't tell you is that in 2012, we were using the WCLI, and we were at 110. So in the last 6 years, we've cut 4% off our RCA. We're currently using 106 because of the WCLI, and Campbell is 105. At the same time, we've undergone the cuts of the last couple of years that you're well aware of. So we've dealt with an RCA adjustment that's been hurtful in our district. What's interesting is this is an art and not a science. But regardless of how you look at it, you must look at the assumptions of each of these models. And I just want to give you an impact on Campbell County since 2005, what the Hedonic would look like had you adopted the recommendations that came to you, the 4 different recommendations since, or I should say 5 different recommendations since 2005. 2005 index for Campbell County is 106. That's Dr. Baker's work. In 2011, after a failed attempt during recalibration to update the Hedonic, during the next 2 years, there was an attempt to update it again, and Dr. Taylor did that work and recommended 107 to Campbell County. At that time, we were receiving 9% because we're utilizing the WCLI. That said, we still battled that methodology in terms of we didn't support it then and we don't support it today. In 2013, I believe it was Representative Harshman worked with Dr. Godby, and an HWI called the 2010 Godby was recommended or discussed in legislative meetings that would have provided 111 to Campbell County. In 2015, again, the services of Dr. Taylor were received to determine a recommendation, and she recommended the OES CWI, which would have been 115 for Campbell County. Last year, APA recommended 117 for Campbell County. And here we are, less than 1 year since that time, with a recommendation of 105. You have to look at the science behind these numbers that vary widely. And about the only thing that I can understand is the distance to Yellowstone shouldn't be in there, and it's no longer in there. I appreciate that because it never made sense to me. But once you get into the statistics, I have to turn it over to my friend, Mr. Deely. So again, those numbers, 106, 107, 111, 115, 117, and now the smallest of all, 105.
Thank you, Don Deely, representing Campbell County School District, Co-Chairman Northrup, Co-Chairman Coe. I agree with Dr. Taylor in some respects. The 2005 Hedonic is badly out of date. Using a longer time series of 5 years truly makes good sense. Factoring in living greater than 25 miles from the nearest hospital as a measure of isolation and lack of amenities, that's a great improvement. However, as Dr. Ayers spoke about, I go back to 3 years ago to the Dr. Taylor's work in October of 2015 on page 5 of that document. I'll quote, "A CWI measures regional variations in the price that school districts must pay to attract high-quality teachers by observing regional variations in the salaries of comparable professionals who are not teachers. It is based on the premise that all types of workers, not just teachers, demand a higher salary when the price of a home is high, the climate is inhospitable, or the closest hospital is many miles away." On page 27 of that same document, I recommend that the Wyoming legislature consider replacing the current three-way design of the RCA with the OES CWI. The OES CWI has a number of attractive features. It is clearly outside of a school district influence, eliminating the risk that the regional cost index would misidentify high spending districts as high cost ones. It reflects not only regional differences in cost of living, but also differences in local amenities. The CWI methodology is also the most common approach to regional cost adjustments in other states. Wow, she had me at OES CWI. As Dr. Ayers said, the OES CWI in Campbell 3 years ago was 115. It's now 105. I'm going to concentrate on just a few mineral producing counties. Converse in 2015 was 100. Now Converse 1 in 2018 would be 96. Converse 2, 93. Sublette 1 and 9 in 2015, 114. Currently 199. A 14 and 15 point change in 3 years. Sweetwater 1 and 2. They were both 112 in 2015. Now they would drop to 104 and 103, an 8 and 9 point drop. Here are my concerns. The Wyoming Cost of Living Index carries too much weight in this 2018 HWI. It needs to stand by itself as one of the legs of the stool that gives a district the higher of 2 options or 3 options. As Janine said, it does not measure the cost of home ownership, only rentals. Another concern I have, it's outdated. Online shopping has replaced many traditional purchases. Amazon and Cabela's don't care what your zip code is. Everything is priced the same, regardless where you live. And then again, back to the wages, there is a county wage index, which is discussed in this 2018 work, but it seems to carry very, very little weight, resulting in much lower than expected 2018 CWI for districts in counties with high wage earners. For these reasons, I would ask the Joint Education Committee to reject this proposal and to continue to explore the options of updating the 2005 HWI. It badly needs updating, but it needs to be updated with a more suitable index that truly reflects the regional differences in Wyoming. Thank you, and be glad to take any questions.
Questions? None appearing from the committee. Thank you. Anybody else public testimony? Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chairman, one quick point of clarification. The OES Hedonic Wage Index is the same thing. I mean, the OES county is the county wage index currently presented in Appendix B of this report and embedded in the Hedonic Wage Index. It has basically half the influence of the WCLI in that index because that is what best explains the pattern of compensation for teachers in the state of Wyoming.
Did you get that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Question? Representative Freeman.
Right. I've been hearing this for about 8 years and stuff, and I still think that this is economics that I don't understand. So when you're looking at Wyoming Cost of Living Index, do you give that a weighted score to where that you're going to have an effect on what's going on in here, or the county wage index, or is it all equally put on there?
No, Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, each of the cost factors in the model has a weight where that weight is statistically identified as the best for predicting the earnings of teachers in the state of Wyoming. So, and those weights are presented in Table 3 of the report.
That's my second question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
All right, we're going to move on to
School district cash reserves and local revenues, and we're just going to try to hurry it up a little bit. Not that we're trying to hurry anybody, but
we're only an hour behind.
take a break.
Nope. You want to take a break? Go.
No breaks.
No breaks. We're going. So Kim and whoever's leading.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Megan Degenfelder with the Department of Education, Again, with me, Kim Morrow and Trent Carroll, also with the department. As part of the committee's interim study of school finance, the department has reviewed both local revenues excluded as local resources, as well as cash reserve balances and uses. The review of local revenues is fairly brief, as the working group, which included members from the School Finance and Data Advisory Committee, determined that the vast majority of exclusions are in fact being coded correctly. These local revenues would include examples such as rental on school facilities, summer school tuition, private donations, or interest earnings. Nevertheless, the department will continue to offer continued guidance to school districts on reporting, including best practice information as well as additional training in order to continue this reporting accuracy. Moving on to cash reserves, there are three mechanisms in which a school district can maintain cash reserves. The first is through a general fund cash reserve account, the second through a special reserve account, and the third a building fund. Page 2 of your memo will begin first by running through the general fund cash reserve accounts. All districts maintain a general fund for accounting of their financials, and state statute allows for districts to maintain an operating balance or cash reserve of no more than 15% of its foundation program guarantee. If those reserves exceed the 15% limitation, they would be counted as local revenue. However, there are several exclusions to the 15% limitation, which I will run through quickly. The first is federal impact aid. Federal impact aid provides payments in lieu of taxes to school districts with large parcels of federal land. This could include Indian trust or treaty land or military bases. U.S. Code does specify that impact aid must be excluded from local or state revenues. And as of 1617, 8 school districts reported an impact aid balance totaling just over $73.5 million statewide. The second exclusion to the 15% cash reserve limitation are what we refer to as the pre-1997 cash reserves. Wyoming Statute 21-313E provides that cash reserves ending June 30th of 1997 are excluded until fully expended by the district. In other words, these amounts are only reduced once a school district's ending cash balance falls below the amount carried forward, or if they run through their general fund operating account and dip into those pre-97s. As of 1617, 42 districts reported maintaining a pre-97 balance totaling just under $36.4 million statewide. The third exclusion is the 1999 half-day kindergarten error. In 2002, the legislature appropriated an amount not to exceed $13.9 million for a 98-99 error in kindergarten funding. This amount has been excluded unless expended by districts and balances roughly $11.8 million statewide. And lastly, protested tax revenues are excluded from the 15% limitation following the fiscal year in which that revenue is received. These must, of course, be certified by the county treasurer and represent the smallest category of exclusion. If you turn to Table 1 on page 3 of your memo, this shows the statewide general fund cash reserves as well as those exclusions that I ran through. You'll see that the unrestricted fund balance is included, those exclusions, as well as the net unrestricted fund balance, which in 1617 totaled just under $169.4 million statewide. Appendix 1 at the end of this memo also includes those general fund cash reserves by individual district. The second type of reserve fund is the special reserve fund. State statute allows for school districts to transfer up to 10% of their total budgeted amount into a special reserve fund. Special reserve funds are not included within district audited financials, and therefore we do not collect those at the department. However, in an effort to gain a better understanding of these funds, we did send out a statewide survey in which 46 of 48 school districts responded. 35 of the 46 respondents reported maintaining a special reserve fund. And of those maintaining a special reserve fund, they reported using funds for depreciation reserves, for equipment, for replacing equipment, or to maintain or enhance facilities. Turning to page 4, table 2 represents special reserve fund transfers and expenditures from 2000-2001 to 2017-18. These are solely as reported by the districts in the survey, and the statewide balance is estimated to be roughly $102 million as of 17-18. The final type of reserve fund is a building fund. School districts can create a ballot initiative, which, if successful, authorizes a levy amount not to exceed 4% of assessed valuation of taxable property. These are also not included within districts' audited financials, but we did include a question within the aforementioned survey. As of 17-18, the estimated total balance is $17.3 million statewide. With that, I know I ran through that rather quickly, Mr. Chairman, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Megan? Megan, was it always 15% on the general, on number 1? 15, okay, go back. General cash, yep, 15%.
Mr. Chairman, that's included in Wyoming Statute 2113, 313E. I don't have the background on that cap at this time, but I'm happy to look into it.
Anybody else, any questions?
Cannot be easy.
Right.
Again.
We're staying. Good. I guess we're staying.
We're on for the next topic, I believe, Mr. Chairman.
Let's get public comment on this.
Okay. Okay.
There's
Oh.
a bill after, so let's get public comment. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Reintroduce the bill and then. There we go.
All right, Mr. Chairman, we're looking at 19 LSO 90, and LSO was asked to draft legislation to remove the exclusion of pre-97 reserves from the school district reserve calculation. And so this bill accomplishes that, and then it reinserts that exclusion for a period of time. So on page 2 of the bill, lines 7 through 12, you'll see the removal of the exclusion. And then down at the bottom of page 3, section 2 reinserts it, but only temporarily. The committee can decide how long it would like to reinsert the exclusion for. Mr. Chairman, that's the basic concept of the bill. I would be happy to answer any questions about it.
Right, that's the bill. Any questions on it? For Ted? Okay.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, just to give some context to where this, if you recall the June meeting, the 1990s or the pre-97 funds are looked at only on a snapshot basis, and districts really don't account for these separately. They rely on the Department of Ed to use their CPA audits at a snapshot at the end of the year basis. And so there's really not a separate accounting per se of these funds. It's if the amount is greater than or less than the previous year's fund balance. And so This gives the opportunity for the committee to sunset funds from July 1st of 1997.
So let's see how much that will
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, the pre-97 balance is 36.4 million. And I would, the Department of Education does provide the half K error balance and however, the statute, there's no authority in the law that provides for that exclusion. So I would just, when you look at the bill draft in subsection E, there is no exclusion for that pot of money.
Any other questions? All right, we'll take public comment.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Appreciate the chance to speak on this issue. And again, in the interest of time, I'll be brief. First of all, the way this bill is written is it's really bad. I'm just gonna be very honest with you. And here's why. The 15% isn't adequate already. And so if you remove the pre-97 reserves, we're gonna have a heck of a time making basic monthly payroll. And I'll give you a real life example. Our district is an entitlement district. We generally receive the vast majority of our funds in 10 payments, August through May. Here's the problem. I get no money in June and July. That's 60 days. I still have to make payroll. So if you take 61 days and divide that by 365, that's 16.7%. So if you remove the pre-97 reserves, I'm not sure how our district's gonna make that work, number one. Number two, what if you had that special ed kid move in? That's a high cost special ed kid. Reserves are designed for the unpredicted. So that's another significant reason not to remove district's authority to reserve. That's why we do it. We budget very well for the predicted and the expected. The reason for reserves is twofold. One, simple bill cash flow. Two, to reserve for the unexpected. So again, if I would suggest anything, I would suggest leave it the way it is and make it 20% in terms of what districts could reserve of their foundation guarantee. So that would allow even up to almost 90 days, which is highly recommended by all of our auditors, to have somewhere between 60 and 90 days of cash reserves on hand simply to pay bills. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for questions, but again, try to keep it brief.
Questions, Jeremy? Thanks, Jeremy.
Yes. It has changed. Mr. Chairman, Jed Ciccarelli, newly minted business manager in Laramie School District Number 1. I just would like to provide a little bit more context. Granted, I did present this information with Matt at the last meeting in a completely different capacity, but did want to share just a little bit of additional information beyond what Jeremy shared earlier, just with regards to that cash reserves has been largely a policy decision in the surrounding states. And as Jeremy alluded to earlier, the recommended standard is to have a minimum of 8 weeks of operating expenditures for any municipality or local government for cash reserves. And if you look at some of the neighboring states, you'll see that there's varying policy approaches. Colorado is a good example. They have a minimum of 3%. There are certain states that will trigger indices or it indicates a financial risk if a school district has reserves less than 3%, which may trigger oversight or state monitoring. You look at Nebraska, they allow school districts to have a number of different contingency funds, and they have a sliding scale that can range anywhere from 45 to 20% of reserves based on their student enrollment counts. And you'll see that in a number of different areas. As a matter of fact, South Dakota recently passed an oversight board that will actually allow districts to seek waivers from the cap on their school district reserves. And so there's an opportunity for school districts to appeal to the state for rational approaches to maintaining their reserves in excess of what their state law allows. And so I would just offer that additional information as part of your consideration as you review the bill.
Ted's over there.
Sorry, I'm Ted. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kirk Schmidt.
Mike. Bottom. There you go.
Well, there we go. Kirk Schmidt, Fremont 21. I guess I'll address the specific bill, the pre-97. The question I've always had is, can you do that legally? You have to remember that the reserves that were in place were collected under a system that was allowed at the time. Came from excess recapture that was allowed at the time was 25% and then got scaled down over time. There was money in there from optional mills that were allowed, both board approved and voter approved. So now what you're talking about is taking money that was collected under a system that was in place at the time and basically going back taxing those funds. Just be like having to pay income tax on your savings account. That's the only question I have, is I don't think you can do it legally because you're going backwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Question? Chairman? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say that the Supreme Court in the Campbell 1 case found the school finance system at that point unconstitutional, allowing school districts to continue to retain the reserves from that unconstitutional system. I'm not sure is legally required. If anything, removing the exclusion of pre-97 reserves makes the system more equitable, arguably, I would say.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Kurt.
the Supreme Court decision was prospective, not retroactive. There's a big difference.
Mike, you got a comment?
Mr. Chairman, Mike O'Donnell again. Our system has a number of anomalies built into it, and this is one of them. The accumulation of wealth, however it was done by the districts prior to Campbell 1, which was the 1995 opinion, and then the special session of the legislature in 1997, that essentially allowed every district to keep what they had accumulated at that point and spend it down over a period of time, was all good. The problem that has occurred in the years since is that the districts have chosen to use a very unique accounting system that would be called LIFO, FILO, first in, last out. So what it means is they are never in perpetuity ever going to spend that money down, and it leaves an inequity in the system that districts who were by court order constitutionally inequitable at the time are maintaining that inequity into the future. I think it frankly is the responsibility of this legislature at some point to address that inequity and try to figure out a fair way to solve it. That's all I have.
Mr. Chairman, the thing that's happened in the past, what Mr. O'Donnell is saying is I agree with. However, when let's say a district has $1 million and they spend their cash reserve down to 800,000, that became the new number. You weren't allowed to go back up to $1 million. That was not set. If you spent down, you were where you were. And some districts did that. So some of the balances that are out there are lower than what they started with. So it wasn't like districts were allowed to keep adding to it, and that cash reserve balance was maintained in perpetuity.
Further public comment?
Thank you. Ryan Kelly, Business Manager, Natrona County School District. I'll be very brief. Echoing Jeremy Smith's comments about cash reserves and the amount. Natrona has been proactive since about 2015 in foresight of reduced state funding, preparing early, reducing our operating budget, reducing staff through attrition, being able to accumulate some cash reserves to be more fiscally prepared for further state cuts. If you make changes that affects our ability to accumulate some cash reserves, it could potentially hinder our ability to keep our reductions in Natrona away from the classroom. So it's one of our mechanisms that we see of creating our own stair steps, if you will, to deal with further reduced state funding, and even looking at an anticipated RCA adjustment. If that does hit Natrona, could hit us pretty significantly. Having cash reserves could help us to deal with that in the future. So that's it. Any questions?
Ryan?
Thank you. Oh.
Go ahead,
Representative Freeman.
I don't know how to put this, but we've heard already that we should have a higher cash reserve. 15% is too low to do the months that there's no income that's coming in. So in my small mind, I'm sitting up there thinking if we could raise the 15% to a optimum number and allow school districts to take their pre-1997 cash reserves and put them in there, then I think that would be the best solution to this problem. But I don't know what that number is. We know it's not 15. Could it be 20, 25? We've heard that other states it says you have to have a minimum. But I think if we want to get rid of these reserves, that we should change the law to where that they can put those reserves in their current cash reserves. What do you think the number should be?
Co-Chair, Representative Freeman, I don't have a specific number in mind. It might vary district to district, but I think that might be a fair solution of allowing districts to put the pre-97 monies into existing reserves and bumping that number. I don't have a number to quote you. I think maybe surveying the districts might be a good idea to see what individual district needs are. I'm hearing the answer is 20.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. They're all here. Any other public comment?
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name again is Donna Little-Como, Superintendent of Sweetwater 2. I would ask that you rethink this bill. We only have 52 days of operating cost. We do not have special reserves in Sweetwater 2. We have a little bit of pre-97 money. I think that most of us know, just in our own personal budgets, that the suggestion of having more than 50 days to survive is recommended by most any accountant. I think that one solution may be to increase the reserve amount. We wouldn't have enough to get to 20, but I still think that would be a more fair way to do it, because I think with the differences of the kind of reserves that are happening within districts, you already have that inequity that Mr. O'Donnell spoke about, because not everybody has special reserves, not everybody has pre-97. There's all kinds of things going on. So maybe the thing to do is just raise the amount of the reserve cap and then put everybody on the same playing field. I like 20.
So if we took it to 20, you'd have enough to be able to
Well, I wouldn't have 20%.
immediately on the first year.
But hopefully,
But you
you know,
could
the
within a
conditions
year.
will change.
Or-
Hopefully.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Freeman.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. So if all of a sudden you were faced with having to get rid of pre-97 monies, where do you think that money would go to?
Well, I mean, to just maintain the education, and I'm stuck right now. So the next thing to do is I'll have to cut more program. We don't have a GATE program anymore. A lot of the things that I think are essential to offer a well-balanced education system in Sweetwater 2 is not there now. So if I have to cut more, it's gonna be programs.
Further questions? All right.
Thank you. Anybody else, public comment?
Michael Liggum, Laramie One, former business manager there. I've heard lots of comments, but one area that I haven't heard about, and maybe because we're one of the few districts that are involved in growing enrollment and opening new schools. So I would like to remind the legislator that the funding mechanism is the year following. So we open a new school, we have to hire the teachers, the principals, equip the school, operate it for a year before it flows into the funding formula. So you will see our district's cash reserves go up till we get ready to open a new school, then you'll see them drop back down. So we need flexibility also within the funding model to be able to open those new schools and operate them during that time frame. So hiring principals, putting the staff in there. Previously, I testified about needing funds to buy the library books and equip the school. And it was stated that there was sufficient funding in the model that we should save up those funds in order to do that. So we've received direction to save the money. We know the funding follows the opening of a new school. We have to operate it for a year before that kicks in, kind of thing. So there is a need for those cash reserves to do that. Why don't we just eliminate the 15% and let the public and community listen to the district? So that's an idea. Any questions?
Go ahead, Representative Kenner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. And thank you certainly for your service for many years. As you do go off into the sunset, do you have any recommendation in terms of a percentage, if we would consider a percentage?
To me, it varies between each district. And the reason I say that is you have those mineral-rich districts where the taxes come in December and probably June type of thing, and they don't see the foundation payment and have to spread it out over a period of time. I've heard 90 days, which would be 25%. You've heard, the school funding with new schools opening. If it's a new high school, that's a pretty high dollar type of school that you got to cover the costs on. So that's why I said not to have a max.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mike. Anybody else? Public comment? Now we'll close the public comment portion of this and move to the bill. Mandy, what's your pleasure on the bill? Second. Been moved and seconded. So we'll start discussion on the bill. Go ahead, Jerry. Or I'm sorry. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So what I've been wondering about as we've been looking at this, and this is obviously not the first time we've considered the pre-1997 reserves, the total reserve balance, and all of these things coming together, is what is the state's interest in the maximum amount for the reserve? Trying to figure out why do we care, basically. Now, there is a reason we care, in my opinion, and that is we want to make sure that we limit the possibility of a school district from really just saving too much from one year. That's the only interest I see, because we set a funding model where the intent of the funding model is to provide funds for the district, for the students this year, and we want to make sure that's honored. And we want to then make sure also that the district has sufficient cash flow, so that's one of our interests as well. So we have kind of two competing interests, but anything within the ballpark where a district is accomplishing that, I think we stop caring. It's no longer in our interest. And when you look at the reserves that are available, you see vastly different reserves depending on the district. But I wish my district had more reserves. I know why we don't. But again, we look at the state's management of funds and we see wild fluctuations in the amount of reserves we have at any given time. And we focused for the whole time I was in the legislature of building up a massive cash reserve called the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, recognizing we would have some challenging times. And now everyone in this room has been benefiting over the last couple of years for the fact that we had the foresight to do that. And we certainly didn't spend a lot of time trying to minimize the amount of reserve, at least to any of the recollections of my debate. So I understand the concern from an audit standpoint and an equity standpoint, and we do have some things to worry about with how the 97 are managed, maybe putting them into the general fund reserve concept and eliminating the 97 barrier helps us to look at equity from district to district. Maybe it doesn't. But honestly, I'm still just not compelled that we need the piece of legislation. If we're going to do the piece of legislation, then I would support increasing the cap, merging the funds, and trying to make sure that we hold districts harmless. So that's a better alternative than what we've got in the books. But at this point in time, I just don't see a problem. I see a solution looking for a problem. And I'm interested to know if anyone on the committee sees otherwise.
Thanks, Senator. And I too feel that since they're pre-$97 and that money belonged to the districts and was actually taxpayer money that was given to the districts under a different scope of light, I still feel like that is district money, and that also it seems like then we're going to up the general reserve so that we can make up for money that we're taking out of this hand so we can put it in this hand. It doesn't seem to me like we're gaining anything, so except for counting money. Anybody else? Comments? Comments on the bill? Going once?
Call for the question.
All right, question's been called.
Roll call.
We have to have roll calls, right?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So the motion is to introduce the bill for the 2019 session.
Mr. Chairman, quickly, I just noticed on page 3, we just have XXXX for a year. I think we would probably need to insert a date there if we want to move this bill forward for a actual consideration in the next session.
Mr. Chairman, that's a good catch. Representative Brown's part. That's the portion of the bill that keeps the pre-97 reserve exclusion for a period of time. I didn't insert the end date of that period of time simply to allow the committee to make this decision.
Go ahead, Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, I just had a question for anyone on the committee. You know, we heard some testimony about leaving it up to local control. And if we were to do that, I think it would be a good idea for us to consider what process, either through a formal rulemaking that the district would need to undergo, or we've heard discussion about increasing the 15% up to 20. Is there anyone that would rather work this bill with amendments and maybe give it some thought for our November meeting versus just voting on it as is right now? up or down. I'm just curious if anyone wants to put the effort into doing some amendments.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
I think if that was made as a formal motion, I would probably be willing to second that. And I think it would also give us a little bit of time to work and reach out to our local school districts and see what their thoughts are. And maybe we can get a little bit more definitive answer if 20% is enough and or what this would actually mean to our local school districts as opposed to the 5 minutes testimony here.
That's just.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would withdraw my motion on the bill with an understanding that we're going to table this bill until the November meeting. You have to go to my second.
Second degree?
Yes.
All right. So LSO
19 LSO-009.
0090 will be tabled until the November meeting, at which time we'll work the bill. That's a polite way.
We're almost done. That's good.
All right, with that, we are at K-12 transportation fiscal efficiencies. And Megan, you're up.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Megan Degenfelder with the Department of Education, and with me is Justin Budd, the Transportation Director within the department as well. You will recall that at the June committee meeting, the department presented on a preliminary transportation efficiency report as required by the 2018 House Bill 140 and Senate File 72. And today we will present on the final transportation efficiency report. In order to best identify transportation efficiencies, the department completed a comprehensive review of state and federal statutes around transportation, as well as current practices within Wyoming. Appendix 1 at the end of this memo includes all of the state and federal statutes that were reviewed, and Appendix 2 includes each of the components of Senate File 72, including the statutory authority, current practice, recommended best practices, and necessary changes. From this exercise, we were able to identify recommendations within 5 key areas, which I will walk through with the committee. The first recommendation, which begins on page 1 of the memo, is related to fleet maintenance and routing software. Across the nation, we are seeing a movement to telematics systems in transportation, where detailed data from vehicles are sent back to a central location, they're analyzed, and efficiencies are created. Mr. Chairman, it's the K-12 Transportation Fiscal Efficiencies Final Report.
That one lines up a lot better.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, continuing on with the fleet maintenance and routing software. A comprehensive telematics system with routing capabilities, fleet management, as well as diagnostics could lead to significant efficiencies within K-12 transportation, which could be achieved through structured repair schedules, different routing schedules and routes, as well as even vehicle start and stop, as well as idle times. In order to explore such a system, the department visited with both school districts as well as other state agencies, and we found that only about 33% of school districts use some sort of routing software. Now, the levels of service as well as vendors really vary from district to district of those who use them. And in visiting with other state agencies, Motor Pool utilizes 2 different vendors, one for fleet management and one for diagnostics. However, they do not maintain a routing software. As for YDOT, they use another vendor for fleet management software, but do not maintain diagnostics or routing software. So again, those were preliminary research in the realm of telematic systems. So the recommendation included within the memo mentions that the legislature could pursue the purchase of a state telematics system.
That's Senator Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stegenfelder, you mentioned the other agencies. It sounds like then there's enough consistency with what the different agencies need from the software that we could potentially be buying one package for the state of Wyoming and have different districts utilize it as well, so that we kind of get the package deal. Is that what you're envisioning?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, we have visited with these agencies about that possibility. Unfortunately, we are looking at different needs
right?
based on our agencies, and so we have explored that somewhat, but we certainly haven't gone into a lot of specifics or details.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I'll also add that normally it's by per vehicle basis. It really wouldn't we wouldn't realize any potential savings going with a statewide or piggybacking on an existing contract with the state.
Go ahead. You don't think that simply the market volume would allow us to negotiate a better rate?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that makes sense to me, and that's what I thought as well. But talking to the motor pool in more detail, it doesn't appear it would.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I will then move on to the second area of recommendation. The second recommendation area is around evaluation of allowable reimbursements. And this is currently taking place through our review of Agency Rules Chapter 2 and 20. We have met with stakeholder groups to review the rules, and we will continue to do so throughout the fall. Potential efficiencies that are being explored by these committees include expanding walking distances, fleet size formulas, as well as cost sharing of activity miles. The third area of recommendation is on page 3. This may look familiar to you, the extension of bus replacement schedules. Table 1 was included in the June preliminary report, and it includes proposed replacement cycles as agreed upon by the Pupil Transportation Advisory Committee. You'll see that the proposed replacement cycles are 1, more in line with national averages, and 2, they remove any reference to minimal, average, or optimal standards. On page 4, table 2 shows the cost differences between the current replacement cycles and the proposed replacement cycles. You'll see that from 17-18 to 22-23, we would have a reduction in reimbursable buses of roughly 46%, with a savings of $36.4 million. I will mention that these calculations do not include, number 1, the current bus purchase moratorium, and they also do not include associated maintenance costs.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Stegenfelder, you've heard me rant on this before, so you won't be surprised. We have to have those numbers. Again, the national reports and assessments that actually look at fleet vehicle lifetime optimize, and they come up with numbers that are far shorter in terms of the lifetime to optimize the maintenance costs relative to the replacement costs. So is there a way that we can get those numbers? I mean, I love seeing save $36 million, but when you have half the equation, I'm worried about going forward and having confidence in that number. What can we do to get those numbers?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you're correct. We've had this discussion before. We found through our study that it's very difficult to find that sweet spot of the replacement schedules versus those increased maintenance costs. We'll continue to look at that. We've, like I said, explored nationwide studies, and it's very difficult. And these proposed replacement schedules, as discussed by the Pupil Transportation Advisory Committee, that was a discussion that it would there would be associated maintenance costs, and those numbers we unfortunately do not have, but we'll continue to work on those.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll continue on with the next recommendation, which is around incentives for transportation sharing. Current statute does allow for an incentive program in which districts can share services related to transportation. However, districts historically have not participated in high volumes. In fact, in 17-18, no school district participated in this incentive program. There are different areas in which we could explore for districts to share buses or other assets. And so the suggestion here would be to explore including those incentives within the sharing program.
Go ahead, Senator.
Have you heard any feedback on why they're not engaging? Is it the limit, maybe the $50,000 maximum combined limit? Is there any reason that we know of why we're not seeing sharing?
I've not heard, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I've not heard specifically why they don't share. I think previously, under the 100% reimbursement model, there wasn't incentive to share. And so this was we're just getting into the new cap. And I think even with the new cap, there will be hesitation to share just based on geography, individual district characteristics, and other factors.
Go ahead, follow up.
Is the $50,000 maximum for any combined service statutory, or is that in rule?
That, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that is statutory.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no other questions, I will continue to two additional considerations.
Comment? Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I want to clarify, the $50,000 is for each agreement. So if you have multiple agreements, it could increase. Let's go that 50,000 is $100,000. It is 50,000 for each school district. So, and it's for each agreement. So, Fremont County's going to have multiple agreements. Sheridan County's going to have multiple agreements.
Mr. Chairman?
Any other questions? Comments? All right, go ahead.
Two additional considerations for the committee are regarding the current bus purchase moratorium, as well as the cap on operations and maintenance funding. There is much stakeholder support for the repeal of the bus purchase moratorium, as it really defers replacement costs as well as increases long-term maintenance costs. Additionally, stakeholder groups have expressed support for amendment of the current operations and maintenance funding cap. You'll recall that currently, moving forward, the operations and maintenance expenses will be capped based on the average amounts received in 14-15, 15-16, and 16-17. Stakeholder groups have expressed support for more of a rolling average or for adjustments for inflation. Both changes to the moratorium and that operations and maintenance cap would require statutory changes. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the overview of the efficiencies report. And if there are no other questions, I could continue on to the report, the preliminary numbers on 17-18 expenditures.
Do you repeal the moratorium on bus purchases? How many buses?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I don't have the exact number that we would be purchasing in the first year, but that estimate in table 2 on page 4 is through 2023. And, over 5 years, essentially with the miles that the districts put on per year, we really need just keep up with life cycle replacement. We should probably be replacing between 80 and 90 buses per year statewide. But that doesn't account for the current backlog we have because of the moratorium.
Thank you. Go ahead, Representative Freeman.
So this table and these numbers, are they based on the proposed changes to where we go 200,000 miles instead of I can't remember the other one, or is it with the current replacement schedule?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, under the proposed replacement cycle, we would have to replace 542 buses between now and 2023. In addition to that, I'm sorry, what was that? How many would we? Between now and then? Yeah, so it'd be 542. That's illustrated in table 2. And that is under the proposed life cycle replacement. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question. When we do replace buses, are they sold at auction? And if they are, who retains the funds? Does it go back to the state? Is it a recapture thing, or what happens?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pappas, there's really not a lot of resale value in the buses when they reach the end of their life cycle. Currently, what I've seen in the last few months since I've arrived here at the department is that the district may get between $1,500 and $3,000 trade-in value for a bus. And what they can do with that is apply that to the purchase price of the new bus, especially if they're going with a bus that costs more than the state base price. So they can use that to, if they're only reimbursed up to the state base price, if they go with a more expensive bid, then they can use that trade-in to offset that cost that they would incur going with the higher priced bus.
Is there a pool that they're buying the buses from, or is it from individual dealers, or how does that work? Is there a way that you can save money on buying volume?
Mr. Chairman, we've considered that, and I actually reached out to manufacturers and dealers to see if the state were to do a volume purchase, if that would mean a greater discount for us. The way they do manufacturing for the state, they base their build on the specifications that we identify as a state. Now, Bluebird or Thomas, they're not building buses just for Wyoming. So they look at it regionally. And I believe Mr. Stoll is here from Bluebird here in Casper. The way he explained it to me and the way Thomas also explained it to me was that they look at bus specifications regionally. They'll take into account the specifications that Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana have all identified as their state specs, and then they'll manufacture buses to satisfy all of those specifications. Say Wyoming has a higher standard for transmissions, Montana has a lesser standard. They'll build to the Wyoming standard and still sell it in Montana. So the way they explained it to me, yeah, I made some notes here. So the current way we handle the state bid is that the Department of Education, in consultation with stakeholders, we define the specifications. Then we go out to, in the absence of a moratorium at least, we would go out to the districts and kind of get a straw poll to see how many buses that they might purchase in that year. The specifications are then let for bid, and there are essentially three dealers that service Wyoming: Lewis Bus Group, Elder Equipment here in Casper, and iState. They'll look at the specifications that we have defined, and then they will give us a bid based on those specifications. Once the state receives those bids, we will average the three for each type of bus. So we have the type A's, C's, and D's. For example, we'll look at the type A bids. We'll average that, and that average becomes the state-based price. The districts then can go out and purchase from any of those dealers, but they will only be reimbursed up to that base price. They can choose to go with a higher or lower but they're still only reimbursed at that base price. And then, but they can choose a different dealer for standardization or better service or what have you.
Representative Simpson.
I mentioned to you in our last meeting that I think that this is worthy to investigate further, and I've worked with Mr. Budd on this. I'm still of the opinion that we can save significant money if we treat this procurement process different than what we're doing right now. I base that on my experience. I'm a consulting engineer, and I've never bid out buses before, but I have specified literally hundreds and millions of projects that we bid out. This has been my experience. When the bidding process happens, see, we use the word quotes and bids differently. Right now in the state of Wyoming, we bid out our trucks and cars that are part of our state fleet. And yet in this process, we only ask for quotes. The manufacturers are not obligated to give their best quote to the suppliers because there's no incentive. They just give a good quote. We believe they're working in good faith, but they give a good quote and then we average and establish, and then the school district gets to choose whatever supplier and manufacturer they go with. That's going to be way different than a hard bid that we get and we select the low bidder. Mr. Chairman, as we come off the moratorium, and we're talking about a couple hundred buses at least, this represents a significant amount of money. And I think right now is the time to process, to make that. And so, Mr. Chairman, I need some help from you. I don't know where to take this next. Would a motion to direct LSO or the Department of Education to develop a protocol of how we would approach this and bring it to our next meeting so we can learn more about the potential of actually bidding out buses? What should we do at this point to receive some further instructions at our next meeting?
Actually, a business manager would probably have a better idea how to bid than I do. But yes, I would have to direct LSO to figure out how to come up with a bidding.
So should I make a motion? Would that be appropriate?
Go ahead, Ted.
Mr. Chairman, I think it would make sense to allow WDE to finish their presentation, provide, have public comment,
Right.
and then proceed any motion on those topics.
That work with you?
That's fine. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to.
Sorry to be at the last minute here, but you were mentioning that school districts will sell those buses maybe for $1,500 to $2,000, or apply that to a newer bus that is above and beyond the state standards or the specs. What kind of amenities do school districts order on top of the buses that the state will already provide at a baseline?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Peeper, excuse me. So there are a list of approved options that districts can request when they purchase a new bus. Things like external heaters, air disc brakes, cameras, backup cameras, seat belts, things like that. I'm sorry? Yes, automatic chains as well. Those things are, those are defined in Chapter 2 of the WDE rules, and they can request those on each bus, and those are considered by the committee at WDE for approval or denial based on the situations. For example, some like activity buses generally would require some underbus storage. A route bus probably doesn't need that. So, we consider those factors when we're approving those options.
Co-chairman.
Just a follow-up question. Do you bid these buses with the video cameras on them, or do the districts put those on?
Mr. Chairman, those the districts put those on. Right now, Chapter 2 is also under revision, so we're considering making some of those options standard equipment in the new version of Chapter 2. For example, air disc brakes. It makes sense to put air disc brakes on every bus because of the safety, and also they're easier to maintain. We get longer life out of them. So things like that are being considered as standard options during the Chapter 2 rewrite. Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines, is the seatbelt issue part of that discussion?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, that is correct. Seatbelts are part of the discussion right now. In May of this year, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration recommended to states that don't have legislation requiring seatbelts that they enact legislation. And the way we've treated that so far in the interim between our versions of department rules is that any bus request that comes through with seatbelts as an option that they're requesting, we automatically approve that. But we have not added that as standard equipment yet as part of the Chapter 2 rewrite. That's still under consideration.
See.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now move to the second transportation memo entitled K-12 Transportation Expenditures. School districts are reimbursed allowable transportation costs based on their prior year expenditures. And as a result of the aforementioned cap on operations and maintenance, transportation costs will be paid in 18-19 and each year thereafter based on the average received in 14-15, 15-16, and 16-17. Appendix 1 at the end of this memo does provide preliminary operations and maintenance expenditures by district for fiscal year 17-18, which total about $78.5 million. Turning to page 2 of the memo, Table 1 represents funding model transportation reimbursements from 2014-15 to preliminary 18-19. You'll see that transportation expenditures as percentage of the foundation guarantee hover right around 6.1 to 6.5%. Figure 1 below shows transportation expenditures by object category. And you'll notice that salaries and benefits consistently represent the largest object category of transportation expenditures. On page 3 of the memo, Table 2 represents transportation expenditures by function category. So transportation expenditures of to from school versus activities. You'll see that for preliminary 2017-18, the percentage of expenditures to from school are 89.4%, and those attributable to activities are 10.6%. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, Appendix 1 will provide expenditures for operations and maintenance. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
Question, go ahead, Representative Landon Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Degenfelder, can you just make sure that I'm reading this correctly, that in our infinite wisdom over the past 2 years, we said we were going to put a rolling expenditure cap of the past 3 years, and it looks like it's actually going to end up costing us $2.2 million more than if we would have just continued on with the previous year's expenditures. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, so let me reiterate, it is not a rolling average. It is simply an average of what is received in those years. So it's actually what was expended in the previous years of that set number of 3 years, but what is received in 14-15, 15-16, 16-17, no rolling average.
And so, Ms. Degenfelder, just to make sure I do understand that, then at that point, it is going to cost us $2.2 million more than if we would have just stuck with the funding for 17-18.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, that's correct. We actually saw in 17-18 a small dip in operations and maintenance expenditures.
Senator Rothfuss.
Just a reminder, one of the reasons that we did the 3-year average was recognizing that different districts would buy their buses at different times. and have different sort of stochastic purchases. That was the attempt to compensate for.
Matt, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if the department's addressed or I can address it. There is an anomaly. These data are preliminary, so they may change. And I'll let the department take a stab at it. All right. So, Mr. Chairman, it may appear that there is a decrease. I'm not sure yet. The three-year average contains funding for aids for special education students on and off the bus and transportation for those students. Based on guidance from the Department of Education on their proposed rules for special education, which aren't effective yet, they have advised districts for expenditures in school year 17-18 for those costs to transport special ed students are now claimed in the 401. So the 401 now includes expenditures for the transportation of aids, and the three-year average includes the cost of transportation aids. So there's a duplication of expenditures currently in the preliminary expenditures for both transportation and special education. So I caution that these are preliminary numbers, and we're working through that anomaly.
Further questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, the type Cs and Ds are all diesel. Type As have gone to all gasoline.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Co-Chairs and committee. I'll be slightly less brief, but still brief. Jeremy Smith, Business Manager, Sheridan County School District number 1. First of all, I'd like to commend the department on a very inclusive process on the Chapter 20 rewrite. I personally was a part of that, and I know other folks in this room were a part of that. I was not involved in the Chapter 2 process thus far, and but I understand probably a similar comment would be had from anyone participating in that. So I appreciate that from the department. First of all, the moratorium on the bus purchases has to stop. I mean, at some point, it's going to be ridiculous because we have buses that are in desperate need of replacement. Because now we have buses that are getting older, more miles on them, and they need to be replaced because now we're spending money on maintenance and operations, but now we have this funky little cap. So now those costs are coming right out of our classrooms, period. That's it. There's nowhere else for it to come. So at some point in the very near future, like now, in my suggestion, the moratorium has to stop. We have to be allowed. And I think they've done a nice job in Chapter 2 stuff in terms of looking at, can they go a little longer? I don't know if they've hit the sweet spot in terms of a balance between maintenance cost and capital acquisition cost. But certainly, the experts they gathered in the room said buses can generally do that. We can generally maintain them to that standard. I don't know if it's perfect, but it's better than what we're doing. So that's comment number 1. And number 2, this static average has to go away as well. And 2, I think Representative Brown's point, yeah, you would have spent less if you hadn't had that in the law now this last year. So it's starting to be a little silly in some ways. But here's our big fear: diesel prices. Someone asked about diesel. If we have a static average in the price per barrel of oil, which benefits the state of Wyoming on its revenue side, we have to pay that. And so in order to transport students to and from school, we're going to be paying those extra diesel prices, which are good for the state, but we're capped at what we're capped on a static average that's now already 5 years old in some cases. That last number is going to be 5 years old here pretty soon that comes in. So that has to at least turn into a rolling average subject to the change in the Chapter 20 rules, which I think, if adopted the way we've helped construct them, will certainly save maintenance and operations costs in general to the state of Wyoming. So simply put, I appreciate the inclusive process the department is going through. I know it's a lot of work to do that. but the moratorium on bus purchases has to be eliminated, as well as allowing districts to again go back to leasing buses. Otherwise, we got to talk about that cap or that cash reserve number again. I mean, if you're going to make us buy buses outright and then wait 5 years to get the money back, that number I gave you of 16.7 ain't going to cut it at all. That's not even kind of right. So that the ability for districts to do leases has to go back in. And again, that average has to either go back to a reimbursement under the new Chapter 20 rules, which I think would be appropriate. 100% under those new rules would be fine, or at least a rolling average. So it took a little longer than before. I'm still trying to hurry, Mr. Co-Chairs, but with that, I would stand for any questions.
Roth, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the cost, and we've been talking about the cost, but what are your thoughts on the safety of the vehicles when we have the moratorium maintained? It sounds like your vehicles are not in the condition you'd like them to be.
Safety is absolutely affected the longer the moratorium goes on, without question, because what happens is you put buses on the road for longer than they should. And what that means is the systems on those buses will unexpectedly stop working, i.e. the heater, and it's 20 below zero, and you're somewhere between KC and Casper. And so you're going to start putting students at risk. Those brakes are not being upgraded to the new standard of brake. And so coming down the mountain on 14 or 14A becomes less safe. I don't know if you can monitor. I don't know if there's a degree of less safe, but it's not as safe for sure. You bet. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. Anybody else public comment?
Chairman Northrup, members of the committee, Tammy Johnson, coming to you as a parent. My daughter is on the Laramie High swim team. Last year during their season, 4 buses broke down on their way home from different events. So they were stranded, anywhere between Gillette and Laramie on a number of occasions. One after they won the state championship, and there they had to sit for a few hours until they could be picked up. It's amazing the districts in the state have a great system to go help each other when buses break down. It happens so frequently. They're really good at it. So as a parent, I worry a great deal about their safety, now that the buses are wearing out. So just wanted to give you that bit of info.
Good system when I was on the school board all through.
Yeah, still working.
Anybody else?
Chairman, Co-Chairman Northrup, committee members, Dennis Holmes, Campbell County School District Associate Superintendent. Just one comment. Can appreciate the work that's been done here. On the extension of the bus replacement schedule, my only concern is this is based on a national study, and I did hear a little bit of information talking about a regional study. I just wonder if the proposed replacement cycle was based on a regional study with states with similar climates and conditions, if that replacement cycle might be lessened slightly, or perhaps half of the increase would be taken into consideration. So, thank you.
Questions for Dennis? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kirk Schmidt, Fremont County District 21. I just need to clarify the process a little bit on bus acquisition. You have to understand the genesis of where all the Chapter 2 and the bus bidding requirements for the state of Wyoming came from. There are national standards for buses. And if you open it up to where everybody in the state of Wyoming could bid all the buses that were available, it'd be a mess, because different districts have different needs. We were able to, in Wyoming, since it's small enough, to cull that down to where we can, when they are bid, and the state bids them, there are formal bid documents, and there are ranges. You can bid a bus that has a minimum standard, because you have districts like Laramie and Natrona County who buy buses that never leave town. So they can have a minimum horsepower to them. They don't need to drive over 50 miles an hour or 55. They don't need to go down the highway. but the vast majority of the school districts in the state can't do that. We use buses in town, out of town, for activities, for different things. So we're buying buses that might be different than that. But there is a very small number of buses that the state is going to buy, whether it's Thomas, whether it's Bluebird, whether it's other buses, but they are bid, and the standard is pretty low. When we trade in a bus, that trade-in comes off the base bid. Doesn't come off any of the options, doesn't come off anything else. It comes off the base bid. There's two things that could happen. You could trade it in so it lessens how much you're paying for the bus, which gives us the state system the benefit of that. If I go out and sell a bus on surplus, it becomes a local resource to me. So the state still gets the money back one way or another. Now, in most cases anymore, we trade the buses in. There isn't that great of a market out there for school district to try and auction off buses. It used to be that way, but that market does not exist anymore. So it's just easier for us to trade it in, and then it becomes the vendor problem. But in either case, the state benefits from that. The other thing you need to understand is we do a pretty good job of taking care of fleets when we're rotating buses. We talked about people having high volumes of miles on buses. If we use a bus that's primarily used for activities, you're going to put a lot more miles on it every year than you would a route bus. When you get a bus that has over 100 or 150,000 miles on it, you really don't want that bus going distances where it could break down. So we rotate buses. We take the buses that have a lot of miles on them, put them on a route. If they're only running 4 or 5, 10 miles a day, the chances they're going to break down are lessened, and they're close to home. I mean, that's just the way the system works. I mean, we do a pretty good job of keeping track of that, and that's where when the bus schedule comes into play, you're rotating them, so you're replacing them more on years than you are mileage, just because of that. And the year thing ends up being a problem because manufacturers don't keep parts for buses, especially body parts. And those are the kinds of things. You don't want a bus out there that doesn't have emergency lights or doesn't have the red flashers. I mean, it's a system that's worked pretty well, and it's been pretty economic over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions?
Representative Simpson, did you want to make a motion?
I would, Mr. Chairman. I'd make a motion that we give direction to the Wyoming Department of Education to develop a protocol of how they would do a procurement process for buses and bring that back to us at our next meeting.
Representative motion. That's the motion, is right.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss. Okay. Anybody? No bites? All right, the motion will die for lack of second, unless I missed it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the representative's idea is a very good one, and perhaps we could structure it where we ask the department to work with staff to try and explore these opportunities, see if there are any shortfalls in current statute, and see if there are any better ways that we can facilitate that type of statewide procurement, because I think there might be something out there if we offer them the opportunity to look into it. So I'd make a motion to invite Department of Education to work with staff on exploring those alternatives for the next meeting.
I'll second.
All right, then move and second.
Yes, Warren. Been moved and seconded that we have the staff explore the options with WDE. Any discussion?
Question?
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Thank you. We'll look forward to seeing that in November, we hope. All right, we're moving on to the next and last item, which is National Board Certified Teacher Program.
So, for the committee is the Bill 1907.
Can you speak into the mic a little more? Thank you. Co-Chairman Coe.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I had a lot of input the last couple of days from the provider that we're partnered up with right now. Everybody knows who that is, and they have some heartburn with the way it's written, the way the rule and regulation is, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with it, except to say that I think it might be a good idea. I'm not trying to put something off, but it might be a good idea that we lay this bill back till November and sort out the differences that the provider has that's paramount in the National Board Certification with some of the rule and reg that's taking place with WDE. I'm not picking on WDE, but there is some heartburn out there right now. And with that being said, I'd like to lay this bill back till November, unless WDE has some comments.
That was my motion, right?
Was that a motion?
Don't make the motion to table.
I guess the question is, we lay it back.
Yeah, let's do that. Good, thanks. So, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great idea, and I support laying it back or support waiting on it basically, but we had a piece of legislation last year that basically accomplished the same thing, that was closely coordinated between the L. Bogan Foundation and the LSO and the legislature. Perhaps we should just revive that one. I mean, it's already been drafted. I think it accomplished the same thing. I guess I'm missing why we changed it, and maybe I'll ask staff, why did we change that?
I don't know if we want to hear from WDE. I'm not sure it's necessary, but, you know, if we're going to lay this back, I'm requesting we lay it back till November. Let's all get together and try to figure out what the differences are, because the co-chair had the same phone call I had. And I was told that the attorney told him not to sign this, or not to sign off on it the way it is right now. So just concerns out there. And I don't think it hurts to lay it back till November at all. So
No.
And Mr. Chairman,
Senator Ellis.
since it's on our agenda, though, I would hope if we wanted anyone from the public one to comment, we'd allow that too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mary Jo Lewis, Coordinator Business Services, Park One. Our concern, we discussed this at our administrative team meeting. Our concern is on the last page on number 6, where it says teachers who accept reimbursement of this section shall serve as a mentor under supervision of the PTSB board for at least one other teacher employed in the state of Wyoming, going through the national certification process. Our concern on that is what does that mean for us as a district? Do we have to allow professional development outside of our district? Does that cost us days? Because if they're mentoring another teacher and they say, well, we need to go to this other district, how many days does that mean for us? We actually support the National Board Certified Teacher Program because they benefit our teachers in our district. And so if we're releasing them from time in our district, is there a requirement for that? And that is not very well laid out here. And it actually indicates that they can accept reimbursement from another district or whatever. But again, that's not very clear in here. So we would not support that as written in this particular section. Thank you.
Representative Brown.
That is based off of, on page 5, it says staff comment that it would actually repeal that. So that's what's actually currently in statute right now, and it actually would end up being repealed with this particular version of this bill. So just a point of clarification.
So then therefore I'm speaking in favor of that then, if that is a repeal. So sorry, we missed that piece. I know, thank you. Yeah. No, I still reserve the right, though, to reject the cash reserve thing when it comes back in November.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer from Wyoming School Boards Association with a very brief comment. Just wanted to underscore the importance of the National Board Certification Program. Belaying the bill, I think, is fine, but just underscore the importance of let's be sure to get it right, because it's a really important program, and we need to make sure that we're finding a way to support that. It's good for our students, good for our state.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're adjourned until 8:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, hey, can we leave our stuff here? Matt Willmarth, can we leave our stuff here?